Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Channel Profit Planning Series. I'm Lauren Goodrich, and I'll be your host for today's discussion. Thanks for joining us. As we head into the final stretch of the growing season, there's a lot happening in the fields across the nation, and it's a great time to check in on what we're seeing and what it means for the growers. I'm joined today by a great panel of agronomy experts from across the Midwest who are going to share what they're seeing in the field this season, how this year's weather has shaped disease and insects pressure, and what farmers should be prioritizing as they prepare for harvest. So let's go ahead and jump right into this conversation. Starting with Lauren, could you give us a rundown of how the weather has shaped your planting and growing season this year so far?
Thank you very much, Lauren. The up planting till now, it's been kind of a tale of two sides of the state. Western Iowa, where I cover, has been very, very dry. Northwest Iowa specifically, and then as you move to Southern Iowa, south of I-80, they're pretty darn wet. At the early part of the season, they couldn't get their crop in. It seemed like at a good time, it was super wet early. And then Eastern Iowa seemed like they could get things in here or there at planting time, and then rains have been more heavy, more sporadic, and more on track, I guess you could say. And so looking at this map here, I pulled from April 1st until August 4th. You can really see kind of the tale of two states here, I say. So we got Northwest Iowa, much of it in a drought, almost in a lot of it in a D3 drought, and then Eastern Iowa is well above average on their moisture. So when looking at the growing season up until now, I'm always concerned with you need a lot of moisture to have diseases. So Northwest Iowa, we're looking a little light on diseases. East and Southern Iowa seems to be having a little bit more disease pressure. But up until this point, I think the crop looks really, really well. Other than aside from too much moisture, you're seeing drowned outs and things like that.
Yeah, it really divides the state in half there, which obviously really creates two totally different scenarios depending on where you're at. Maybe let's go down to Mark. Mark, how's it looking where you're at?
Thanks, Lauren. Uh, Lauren Botine shared the tale of two sides of the states. I think we're probably looking at the tale of the beginning and current part of the season. So we were extremely dry early, which probably delayed planting a little bit. We had some pretty major winds on irrigated acres that led to some uneven emergence just as we couldn't keep the seed zone wet. And then as June hit, we really increased some rainfall. I would say probably above average for what we were used to. A lot of the areas, it was more than we'd received in the last 6 months. And over the last probably 3 weeks, we've been consistently 100 degrees or better. And corn's just really taken a turn, unfortunately. With those June rains, we didn't root down as well as we needed to. And now we're paying a little bit of the price trying to chase some of the water, but we're a little bit slow. So we've led to some flashing, some pretty big drought stress in our crops.
Yeah, that definitely makes for a difficult season here. Monica, how is Missouri looking?
Yeah, so Missouri's pretty similar to both what Iowa and Kansas are experiencing. We had a lot of really early rainfall. Um, it's pretty typical for Missouri and part of eastern Kansas that I cover to have a very long and very delayed, prolonged planting season. But we saw that especially this year just with the amount of rainfall that we had. So we were pretty wet early on. As you can tell, some parts of the state, we're 15 inches above. So it's kind of insane to think about. Started out so wet though that again we were kind of concerned about our corn being able to establish the roots that they needed because they didn't need to find that moisture, right? They didn't need to get down deep. But then we started seeing in July, we started getting really heavy rain, or excuse me, we switched from heavy rain, switched to heavy heat. So we started getting into more temperatures, heat indexes up into the hundreds. Definitely got really warm. But although I can't complain, we actually just got a couple rains today since this graph was taken, picked up a couple inches in a lot of spaces. So never going to complain about an August rain. It's going to help us with our grain fill. I think some people are just wishing we could get like maybe an inch this week and then maybe spread it out and not get 3 inches at one time again, like we've seen a lot this year.
Right. Yeah. These downpours are really, really hurting where we get a lot of rain all at once and then nothing for a prolonged period of time, which really doesn't help us a ton. Okay. So, I mean, maybe starting with you, Monica, here as we still look at Missouri, has the season been drastically different than maybe what you typically expect for Missouri? And maybe how are some of those changes really implementing decisions that you've seen this season?
Yeah, I would say, especially with the wet spring we had, that's been pretty abnormal for us the past couple of years. It seems like we've been drier. Came off a couple of years of drought, started getting more accurate and more needed rainfall when we actually wanted it. So that was really helpful. I will say the one call out this year is we were all kind of worried at the beginning because it was rainy, it was wet, it was cool. It was really shaping up to be another big tar spot year. But because all of our temperatures turned off hot, we've seen that honestly most disease has been pretty low, which has been kind of nice. We've seen some more heat kind of drive some of that down. Obviously, we still have some risk there, but ultimately, I think that's been more of what's driving decision making. So we have a lot of different stage crops in the area, like I said, plantings just all over the board. So that's affecting all things like fungicide decisions. If were you going to pull the trigger, add BTR1 for your early planted, or at this point you're at dent and there's like no disease pressure, right? So you're kind of making that decision for your May planted now, and even getting into early June. And I think that's kind of been the big tale this year is it's not happening all at once. It just seems like the marathon has been prolonged for so long.
Okay, yeah. And so that seems then like the lack of disease pressure we heard, is also occurring up in Lauren's region as well. Can you maybe speak to how the weather is shaping some of your crop health and decisions that are being made in the field this season?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So here in Northwest Iowa, disease is minimal. Goss's wilt is something that I can find pretty prevalent just with the winds that we've been having, tattering the leaves and maybe hail here or there. And it's just so dry, the humidity is so low. And like I said earlier, disease loves moisture. So Northwest Iowa specifically, you can find maybe a lesion or two of, the usuals, northern, a gray, tar spot a little bit, but not near as prevalent as what we've seen in years past. But as you move into southern and southeast or eastern Iowa, you're definitely seeing a lot more or tar spot. It's been confirmed pretty much all around the state, and the big one that I've been keeping an eye out for is southern rust. That disease has impacted I think everybody on this call last year specifically, but just looking at like last year, we had the wettest July on record pretty much. That really drives southern rust to blow up big. And we just haven't had that rainfall like we've had in the past. And so I think we're sitting pretty good. Like Monica said, we're ahead significantly on our GDUs. The corn is much further advanced than in years past. So that decision for maybe a second application of fungicide we could talk about a little bit later, but that discussion is maybe narrowing to not having any of that applied just due to the disease or lack thereof.
Yeah, and it definitely creates a little bit more, risk conversations there for the farmers with, balancing that decision as to apply or not apply. Mark, I know, Kansas, you've been in kind of a completely different, disease conversation based off of the weather. I guess kind of same question for you here, looking at the weather and how it's impacted crop health. What are some of the decisions that are shaping out as you round out the growing season in Kansas?
Right now, we're really just monitoring, similar, to Monica and Lauren. We have crops at various growth stages from B10 through preparing to harvest. So our further along corn, I feel like we've largely outrun the disease unless we have exceptional irrigation capacity on a field. It's those later planted fields that we're monitoring. Gray leaf spot, bacterial leaf streak set in early and have kind of stalled, but I think that's something we'll want to monitor if we can catch some of these later rains or evenings begin to get more humid. Just make sure we're not getting up on that ear leaf and hurting our yield potential there. And then also to launch point, we do have a touch of southern rust coming into the area. Nothing concerning yet, but on planted corn, it's definitely something that we will want to keep our eye on and have that fungicide ready to go should it pick up prevalence.
So as you all are, walking fields and scouting fields with our farmers, during this late season, as we're looking into harvest, what should be some of the things that our farmers are prioritizing as they are preparing for this harvest season? Maybe Mark, would you like to go ahead and start us off here?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So 2 hot button issues that we have in my area right now would be being cutworm and earworm. Flights have been pretty heavy. So if we don't have that Tricepta trait either in our Tricepta package or VT4 Pro, I would be scouting fairly aggressively to see, have the egg masses already hatched or have the worms already gotten into the ear. My biggest concern on that is not only the minimal yield loss, but the potential to introduce ear rots that can be fairly heavy in the area in some years. So we want to keep the cutworm out as much as we can on those. Beyond that, I think the stresses have probably impacted some stock quality. So I would suggest as we're going into harvest, some push tests, just general physiological assessment of your field. How's everything look? And prioritize that order so we can make sure and get the maximum amount of grain out of the field this year.
Makes sense. Maybe going over to Monica in Missouri, looking at the disease and insect pressure that you all are experiencing this year, what should farmers be prioritizing as they prepare for harvest season in your area?
Yeah, I think I'm going to echo what Mark said about it's really important to get out and look at your field, see what's going on, especially in those areas that have had a lot of moisture. Maybe the roots aren't there. Trying to look now, you can maybe start to see if there's anything that's, either starting to ghost from crown rot or even just looking at what looks like it may not have that structural integrity to stand longer. Because as you get further in the year, especially as we turn off hot again, we've kind of been cool with some rains this week. But if we get back to the heat, what is that going to look like? And is that going to cause standability concerns? Because same thing that Mark said, we want to make sure we get that crop out of the field so we're not going to have issues next year. And also there we make sure we have the best harvest we can from this year's crop.
So definitely monitoring, making sure we're looking at that standability concern across all of our fields here. Lauren, up in Iowa, what are some of the things that you would be recommending that your customers are watching out for?
The areas of high rainfall, definitely going to be watching maybe that nitrogen deficiency anytime we're, that's been washed down the drink or maybe isn't prevalent or available for the plant and causing stress, could be causing stock quality issues. Also, any parts of a field or an area that has had drought stress, there's going to be significant stress on the plant to put everything it has towards that ear, so causing stock integrity issues. And something that I came across yesterday in my own family's field, or my own plot actually, is extended diapause with some northern corn rootworm. Came walking down the rows and found a couple lodge plants and had root feeding in a highly rotated, corn bean rotation. So definitely gonna make some recommendations there and talk with, seed pros and customers about keeping an eye out on extended diapause and maybe needing to do, below ground protection in the next couple years with different fields.
Okay. Yeah, and so maybe that feeds, well into here this follow-up question. So considering, say, this extended diapause or, some of the other disease concerns that are coming up in these other fields, are there situations or other management decisions that still make sense for farmers to make right now, or would most of it be, extended into planning for the next season?
So yeah, management decisions right now. Yeah, it all depends on what growth stage the crop is at. Walking fields right now, I'm running into corn aphids, I'm running into some bean aphids where it's wetter. I'm seeing some spider mites. Just really dialing in the pressure there, and maybe it might warrant an insecticide application to help protect the remaining yield there. But yeah, that's just kind of current and current now, but management decisions now, just want to make sure, if you're running into like Goss's wilt, watching, if you're taking any bales off of that field and you're spreading, those bales out somewhere else, you're spreading the inoculum, and same with, anything, tar spot, things like that. So that's some management decisions to keep an eye out for.
Mark or Monica, based off of your regions, would you have anything to add there in terms of management decisions that you'd be strongly considering a farmer make?
For some of our failed acres, where we have chopped for silage, I think a key would be examining if we can get some compost or manure back on those acres. We're typically a low organic matter environment, and I think it's crucial that since we're subtracting all that, we try to add back into it. And looking just a little bit further ahead, I think if we do run into some disease issues, serious consideration on whether we want to till that under or allow it to be on the surface and potentially fester. But it really depends what diseases come in and what our plan will be for next year.
I would echo with that too. I think at this point, since we are in August, and we talked about how a lot of the corn that was planted in April is kind of already there. We're at dent. We're getting close to black layer, getting close to harvest. I think even in soybean, we don't have a lot of disease really showing up, but where there is disease is kind of in pockets. So the big player with soybean right now is going to be the red crown rot. So as we get in the next couple of weeks, that's going to be really important to be scouting for that. It's going to be important they recognize that it's going to look very similar to their SDS or their sudden death syndrome symptomology. And this also could be confused with brown stem rot or even Decta stem borer. So you're going to see that same sort of foliar symptoms, and it's going to be really important to dig down into that canopy and to see what's going on. Now, there's obviously not going to be a lot you can do this season, but one thing I've been telling a lot of growers is it's going to be super important that we get a plan put together for next year. So this is the time of year where you can kind of see what's going on, even if you do have tar spots showing up, things like that, to make those decisions. Like Lauren talked about, how are you going to manage that crop debris that's there, the stuff that's going to allow it to overwinter? Are you going to rotate it to soybean next year? Same with if you have red crown rot, what's your plan? How are you going to manage your equipment in that field to make sure you're not spreading it? So I think this is just a really good time of year to be able to get out and walk your field if you have time, see what's going on, and then work with your local agronomist or even your field sales representative to figure out a best plan moving forward.
Oh, that's great. And it definitely sounds like, at least from continue monitoring into harvest, that red crown rot is going to be pretty critical to make sure that farmers are well prepared, as they go into harvest. From an insect perspective, is there anything you're concerned about that could still emerge here as we are looking into harvest?
Summer, we haven't seen much insect pressure, honestly, outside of like Japanese beetle or bean leaf beetle. But I kind of expect those to be dropping off at this point. We don't have the same rootworm pressure that they see up in Iowa. That hasn't really been an issue for us. So there could be a few things. I know corn leafhopper actually has been kind of in the conversation the past couple of years. So we have actually identified that in the central part of the state, and we're doing some work with the university, with University of Missouri, and have a trial out there with them. So we're kind of on the lookout now that if people start to see any sort of symptomology from any of like the diseases or the pathogens that are vectored. But you may not actually see a lot of that this time of year, but it's just all kind of something to keep an eye out for.
Great, thank you. Mark, I know you had mentioned earlier just some of the different insect pressure that could be coming up. Is there anything you're still watching out for as you all go into harvest season?
Yeah, definitely still watching the late flight of cutworm to see if we're going to have a bigger impact there. And with hot, dry conditions, definitely expecting the mites to begin to flare up. So, starting on the field edges, progressing inward. So, definitely something that we'll want to perform regular scouting on to make sure that we don't lose that green tissue and the ability to, pack the last of the sugars into those kernels.
Mhm.
I guess up here in Iowa, I'd still be keeping an eye on your corn on corn acres and be monitoring. We didn't have, there was a few winds here and there where we could see root lodging, but for the most part, the corn rootworm, I've seen beetles, I've seen plenty of them, but the root lodging hasn't really shown us the feeding on the roots. So I think it'd be very pertinent for a seed pro or a district gentleman to go out and dig roots and provide value to maybe your customers to see if there is any feeding and make a plan going forward for the following years for below ground protection products.
Makes sense. I know that, so Lauren, you mentioned standability, so did Mark. As we're thinking about harvest, is there anything to keep top of mind for growers to help manage, standability if they are running into any concerns this season? And so, Lauren, Mark, both of you mentioned concerns about, potential standability issues going into harvest season. If a grower is running into standability concerns, what would be some of the potential ways in which you would recommend they address that as they are moving into harvest?
So I would definitely be working with your seed pro and just be looking at your fields with variability, fields that maybe have a little bit more stressier acres, maybe your fields that you opted to not do a fungicide on. Like I mentioned earlier, like the disease is maybe minimal at this point, but I still feel that fungicides help with plant health overall, it helps with just overall plant respiration during times of drought as well. So plant or fields that are have a fungicide applied, those maybe on the back of mind as far as harvest first ones, but definitely be keeping an eye out, scouting ones that that weren't sprayed and have a little bit more stress this year, and maybe ones that had a little bit more rainfall. You're the folks over in eastern Iowa and southern Iowa where the rainfall was too great and you've lost nitrogen, or maybe you couldn't get your side dress on at all, and maybe your nitrogen is lacking. Those plants are definitely going to be struggling to kind of finish out here, and taking everything it can and that's out of the stalks to put it towards the ear.
Yeah, echoing Lauren, I think understanding what the field has been through this year is a great indicator. Work with your seed pro to help understand the hybrids that you have placed, what's going to have the strongest roots and stalks on it. And I think push test is just a very quick exercise that we can do in every field to practically check those things. If we do run into problem, great option to look, see is there a wet grain market around you to where you can get that potential issue out of the field a little bit sooner. I don't know, maybe silage could become an option if it's a very tough day, but really just the priority order of your fields. How can we check through and maximize what we're able to capture?
Great. And maybe this might be a bit of an odd question, but as we're looking at harvest season, is there anything that you would encourage growers to avoid at this point in the season? Here at the end of growing season, going into harvest, any watchouts or something to potentially avoid as we go into this part of the season?
I would say a call out for this would be if there's people who still haven't got a fungicide application on but are considering it, to maybe go and actually think about where you're at with your crop itself. Also knowing what product you're Right, because some of these products have pre-harvest intervals. You want to make sure that you're leaving enough time in between the time you're making that application to when you're taking it out of the field. And also just kind of or thinking about the ROI of it, right? At a certain point, is that spray application going to be costing you more than what you're going to gain back? And is it actually going to benefit you? There's a lot of data and a lot of research comes out of both our farms as well as coming out of universities that can help you make that decision as well.
So there's been a lot of work happening behind the scenes at Bayer to monitor diseases, understand resistance for our products that are coming down the pipeline, and really making sure that we continue our commitment to our growers to stay evolve of any of these evolving changes that are occurring. Monica, would you maybe be able to speak to some of the work that's being done near or around you that you've been involved with? And how you've seen Bayer's commitment to research kind of come through in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. So, not only at my site, where we've done a lot of different work in years past with just natural disease pressure that has come in, rating hybrids, looking at how do our fungicides perform, what hybrids are responding to fungicide, etc. There's also work we've been doing to actually make sure that we are finding those fields that have the disease pressure itself. So, a great example of this would be sudden death syndrome in soybean, right? Finding fields that have that already, working with those growers, being able to get variety testing. There's also other times where we're finding spots that maybe have a history of like a frog eye infestation, and things that we can use to test our products. I will also say one thing that actually gives me a lot of hope and joy in the future in terms of how we're looking at our pipeline is we have a big market and network of people who are doing plant disease and plant health testing. So in a lot of these cases, they're doing gray leaf spot, southern rust, diplodia ear rot, tar spot, anthracnose stalk rot, fusarium ear rot, and STS. They're doing all of these things. Most of them are inoculated trials, so they're putting them under pivots in areas that may not have enough water, and they're doing things to ensure disease that way we can continue to make sure our pipeline is going to stand up to the test once it gets out into a grower's hand. So if it wasn't for those folks, and for those of us that are able to get out there and do that hands-on research and do that, we really would not be able to set up our growers for success the way we have.
Right. Yeah. The only way to test for disease is to get the disease out there in the first place. So that's huge.
Yeah.
Good.
And I guess something that we're doing locally, Lauren, as a technical agronomist group, kind of up here in Iowa, Midwest region, we have what we call AMP trials, or agronomic management practices trials, where you have a normal plot, and it could be 1,000 feet or plus, and we're asking different protocols, but asking our plot cooperators to maybe spray the whole plot once with Delar Complete, and then come back at R3-ish to do a second application on only one half of the plot. So that way we can see a hybrid response by fungicide, and make some of those observations on different products of disease pressure, and even different protocols. Maybe one half the plot is not sprayed, so you can really see and make those observations on disease pressure, different things with resistances and tolerances and things. So that's something we're doing that I'm kind of excited about, kind of geeking out about. And then we also have different locations, I think, across the whole channel belt is crown rot studies. So I think different locations where putting a singular hybrid in each individual row of a planter, and planting it out in really early planting and maybe poorly drained soils to get any observations on crown rot and things like that. So that's been very fun to see.
Good. Well, we'll be excited to see some of the results from these trials. That'll be exciting. I guess thinking about next season, and just to kind of wrap up this conversation, what should our growers be keeping in mind as they're planning ahead for next season? I mean, we just hit on, variety testing, some of our hybrid selection. What else should folks be keeping in mind for next season?
I think one of the immediate things that we could probably address is pay attention to, if we had any weed escapes, do we need to do any fall weed control, set ourselves up for a better spring? And then beyond that, working with your seed pros, are there recurring issues you have on the farm that we can help address either through a seed or a CP solution for you? Or maybe it's just better placement, thinking through your rotation, or using the right trait packages in order to be able to maximize the benefit we're getting. So just a couple that come to the top of my mind.
Along with what Mark mentioned, I also, up here in northwest Iowa, western Iowa, a little bit of eastern Nebraska, Goss's wilt is top of mind for us. So monitoring that right now, even rotated acre fields, seeing quite a bit of that starting to pop up. So just getting an idea where that's at, and documenting that and making sure that we're placing the right hybrids there, talking to your seed pro to make sure the right hybrids are placed there, and then monitoring any lodging that could be caused from corn rootworm, for like Mark said, the right product placement and trait packages going into next year.
And I think echoing both of them, they both kind of said the same thing that I would love to say. But even adding on top of that, if we know there are problem fields, get a plan for those too. So especially when we talked about red crown rot, we talked about sudden death syndrome, things like that. Kind of putting plans in place, deciding if you want to keep that in soybean, if you have a certain rotation, if we need to rotate that out. Just figuring out kind of a plan now is going to be so much better than you can walk into that conversation with your seed pro or with who you're buying your chemistry from or who's applying your chemistry, and just kind of get all that figured out now. Because while we always think there's so much time in the winter to get things done, it always goes so fast. So starting those conversations now and thinking about that is going to really help being proactive.
That's all great advice. Thank you all so much for the perspectives you brought to this conversation today. The insights that you shared today, I think, can go a long way to helping our growers, and we really appreciate everyone who is watching here online. And as we wrap up this growing season and prepare for harvest, please don't hesitate to reach out to your local channel seed pro or technical agronomists for support with your operation. Thank you all so much.